Hello and welcome to this episode of the Artist Collective radio show. I'm your host, Shoshana Pearson. With me on the show today is Matthew Kraig Kelly, a master of straddling the lines between art and the everyday. He is probably most popularly known in the artist's world as the frontman to the popular band The Autumns, and he also is a member of the post-punk collective The Sounds of Animals Fighting, as well as the black metal inspired band Pyramids. But he also holds a number of degrees from UCLA, has bylined several peer-reviewed publications, and is a criminal investigator and security specialist. Currently, Matthew serves as CEO of B2G Global Strategies, a firm specializing in international investigations, security consulting, and policy guidelines for business and government entities. And even with such a busy career and home life, Matthew is also married to dancer and choreographer Tammy Rose Johnston, with whom he shares 2 small children. And he still manages to weave a thread of creativity through his everyday life. Let's go now to Matthew and see how he makes it all work. Thank you so much for joining us. Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So there's a lot of stereotypes, I think, about artists being rather myopic when it comes to their art and focusing only on what they do and they know they do well. But you have done a myriad of different things from different kinds of genres, and you have become really good at a lot of different things. So you shelved a music career that you were successful at a bit. You pursued academia for a while, and then you went to becoming a criminal investigator and pursuing a career in the private sector. So to me, it seems like you're at the point that you're at right now. It seems like you're weaving together all of your past experiences into this one particular place and kind of being a master at many things. So tell me, what has compelled you to so many twists and turns in your career? Why are you not so myopic as the stereotype goes?
So thanks for all those nice compliments. Circumstance, roughly. I mean, from the time I was in high school, I was always sort of on 2 tracks. I was in rock bands and was crazy about music. And then I had intellectual interests. And so neither one of those ever left me. I was always pursuing intellectual interests, even when I wasn't at university. And the music never got out of my system either. So I just sort of rode those rails. Like when I was, I think right before I graduated from UCLA, when I got my undergraduate degree, my band at that time, The Autumns, got a record deal. And so then we sort of just went off touring and making records for most of the rest of that decade, most of my 20s.
And was that the deal with Bella Union, or was that a different? Was that after that?
It started with a label called Risk Records, which was based in LA and was owned by Frank Volpe was his name. He used to manage Concrete Blonde and some other acts. He was an Australian guy. And so they were, at the time, labels meant something different than they do now. I think now labels have sort of, setting aside the big ones, the legacy labels, the smaller labels have become little hubs, little scenes, that people get into the labels. You know what I mean? They get in kind of like 4AD. 4AD was like a precursor of this in the 80s. If you were into 4AD, then you were into all the 4AD stuff. You were into Cocteau Twins and this Mortal Coil and so on. Mm-hmm. And so now there's a lot of little labels like that. But when we were doing this, there were labels like that. But the whole concept of getting signed was a thing. Like today, I suspect many bands don't even talk or think that way anymore. But at the time, getting signed was important because music was still being distributed on hardware, on CDs and cassettes and vinyl and so forth. And it was being distributed vertically into the record stores. So you couldn't, if you had a band in LA and you wanted everybody to hear your music, your only hope of achieving that would be to get a record label, which had a distribution deal, which would get your record into the stores. So getting signed really mattered. And it was like a dream to go into a record store one day and see your record in one of those prized slots, right? Where they had your band name and so forth, you know? So, so anyway, yeah, sorry, yeah.
So did you then like were you pursuing your undergrad and you put that on hold because you got this label deal, or were those happening simultaneously?
They were happening simultaneously. So I was at
Okay.
UCLA for the last 2 years of my undergraduate education, and you know the Autumns was out playing clubs and making demos and so on. And so the record deal came sort of right at the right time because I was right about to graduate, so I didn't have to postpone anything. Of course, my undergraduate degree was in philosophy, so it's not like this was preparing me for some sort of career other than maybe a graduate career, like going to graduate school for philosophy, but I had no intention of doing that at the time. So yeah, so we just made records and kind of did what we could when we were back home and not touring to get by, like substitute teaching and different things just to make money, and then what happened is that we very much followed the muse in that band. I mean, we never second guessed our own intuitions artistically. We just did what we wanted to do. And as we got older, we got exposed to a much broader range of stuff that was sort of getting into our bloodstream aesthetically. And we were getting weirder, basically. The last record we made was I listened to it maybe 6 months ago. And I don't really understand what we were doing. It's, we certainly weren't trying to make money. So by the time I was, 29, and things were just getting weirder and weirder and weirder, we weren't going to do anything different. We really didn't know how to try to make commercial music or anything. I realized I better get some kind of plan B going. And in keeping with a total lack of pragmatism, which I'm sure you've already seen, I decided, well, I'll go to grad school because I had become obsessed with Iraq, basically, and the Gulf War. And so I thought, I'm going to go to grad school and I'm going to, write a book about Iraq and the Gulf War. And so.
And what influenced that obsession?
Yeah. So what happened there, this is a little cliche, I guess. 9/11 happened, basically. So my undergraduate education was in philosophy, and that was really where my interests lay. I had no real political interest. I didn't follow politics. I wasn't interested in politics. And then 9/11 happened. I was living in LA in an apartment, and I mean, everybody has their story, but my phone just kept ringing. And this was very much like the rock and roll days, like sleeping late, and my phone was ringing whatever time the attacks.
Early.
Yeah, it was early.
Early for California,
Yes,
especially.
right. On the West Coast, it was early. My phone kept ringing, ringing, ringing. I think it probably was like incorporating into a dream state. And then I was like, my phone keeps ringing. And then I picked it up. I checked my voicemail, and it was Dustin, my friend Dustin, who later actually joined the Autumns, but at the time was just a friend of mine who was another musician. And he was on there saying that the country was under attack, and it looked like it was China. And there were planes heading to the West Coast. This is like, the rumors running wild, right? Nobody knew what was going on. So I could not process any of this because I had no political awareness at all. I was like, China's attacking us? I just couldn't believe it. So anyway, the whole thing kind of captured my imagination. And then I started paying attention to politics and detected fairly quickly that our political discourse, like it is now, was just horribly ill-equipped to come to terms with sophisticated realities, and that we were just trafficking in these ridiculous myths and so on. And so it's a strange sort of story, but basically, I'm now that I'm talking out loud, I think, God, I'll sound so strange and exotic or whatever. Let's just go with it. So I had been an evangelical Christian when I was in high school, and so the only time I paid attention to politics in my life probably was when the Gulf War happened, which was 1991, and I think I was 15 years old. And I was at winter camp, and I had been reading all these books on Bible prophecy and how the end of the world was going to happen, and how it was all going to go down in the Middle East, right? And one of the key things that had to happen, according to these Bible prophecy books, was that the Dome of the Rock, right on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the big gold dome, it had to be destroyed because that was the site of the original, or actually the second temple, the Jewish temple, and that temple had to be rebuilt. There had to be a third temple before Jesus would come back. So you're just waiting for that Dome of the Rock to disappear. And when Saddam Hussein started firing Scuds at Israel, which were notoriously inaccurate, I was like, this is it. It's all going down, man. One of those Scuds is going to hit the Dome of the Rock, and then they're going to build the temple. And they said, this is how I was thinking about it. So I started learning about politics. Fast forward back to me being however old I was, 23 or something, 24, when 9/11 happened. And I started reading about politics, and I was no longer an evangelical Christian. So I was reading a whole different kind of, I'd say much more serious, scholarly type literature. And it drew me back to the Gulf War, which is sort of, it loomed large in my imagination from when I had been a young person. And so I went down the rabbit hole of the Gulf War, and I just became totally obsessed with it. And so I was just reading everything I could get my hands on. And ultimately I thought, well, I'll go and I'll learn Arabic and I'll write a book about this. So that's what sent me
As
off.
one does,
like you do.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So,
like you do, just learn Arabic to.
Yeah. So anyway, this is a long answer to your question, but the point is, I'm sort of all along the way through all of this, I'm always making records and making music, and eventually, the autumn sort of goes away, and then new projects come along, and I'm saying yes to those projects. I'm doing other stuff, and then I'm doing this intellectual stuff, and they're just two tracks. They never really intersect. You know what I mean? I'd say the first time the project I'm working on right now is the thing that's going to bring these two streams together, along with my current career, which is running a security and investigations firm, which is a separate story. But basically, I got a PhD. I wrote a book I ended up writing on Palestine rather than on Iraq. And I taught for a bit at university, and I took a job as a consultant with a security firm. And eventually I took the firm over, a few years later. And so now these things are all sort of coming together in this podcast that I'm working on, this true crime podcast, because there's a score and there's actors and there's writing, and it's all the things I kind of know how to do, which is a few things I know how to do. It's all those things kind of coming together. But this is the first time that's ever happened. Until now, it's been a little schizophrenic. I've just had two lives,
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask if the music ever, if I mean, you answered my question before I could ask it, if those lines ever connected, and it sounds like it took you a couple more decades, or wait, how 20, how old are we? Yeah, we're getting, we're getting up there. Yeah. So before it's funny, your story about 9/11 is very, very similar to mine. I woke up in a hazy, my phone's ringing, listen to my voicemails, what's happening. I started getting focused on doing improv, and you went and learned Arabic and how to people do different things. So
I didn't know that. I didn't know that 9/11 had anything to. That's how you sort of entered the arts after 9/11.
Well, I was already taking classes and stuff, but when that happened, it just became more profound and more important. Laughter is a medicine, and all that sort of thing. It just kind of really came. And then I wanted to do get married and have babies, and so I did that. And anyway, but enough about me. So tell me how your musical experiences and those experiences of creativity and art now inform what you do. Tell me how your current career informs your podcast or the creative outlets that you now have. Tell me a little bit more about that intersection that has finally come to pass after experimenting with all these different arenas.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so at a basic level, it's what I was saying that this podcast was originally going to be a book. So I wrote a book about revolutionary violence in Palestine, which was it's considered a textbook. It's published by University Press, and if you were to get it at Barnes and Noble or whatever, it's a textbook, which is a shame because it doesn't read like a textbook. went to great pains to make it readable to a general audience. But in any case, I knew all along it was never going to make any money because academic books don't make any money. They're sort of, well, they're either a vanity project or there's a contribution to human knowledge or some combination of the two, right? But they don't, neither one of those things makes money. So I had this murder that I was obsessed with since I was a kid, and I just couldn't get it out of my head. I couldn't put it down. It was like a Rubik's Cube I couldn't solve. And so I found myself digging through archival materials, and I thought there's either something wrong with me or I'm writing a book. So let's just write a book. We'll make this our second book, and maybe this book will make some money because it's about a somewhat famous murder. And then somebody, I can't remember who, but someone along the way said, well, why don't you do a podcast? It'd be easier to monetize, and you can bring in these aesthetic components. So to your question, the fact that I'm working with Dustin, who used to play bass for the Autumns. He's handling the music, but it's sort of under my general aesthetic direction. And I'm working with actors. I've never worked with actors before, but that's been a real interesting experience.
I bet.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of stepping into the role of a director because I have a certain idea of the kinds of performances I want. You provided a brilliant performance. A lot of the actors just took it and ran with it, and we went way beyond anything I could have imagined. You're a case in point. And so, that's a kind of basic way in which these aesthetic components are coming together with an intellectual project, because the project ultimately is to bring a degree of rigor and historical knowledge to this murder case that has never been there. There's been many books written about this case, but none of them, in my opinion, have been as rigorous as they should have been.
Do you feel comfortable saying which case it is, or do you want to say that as?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so
Okay.
it's the Jeffrey Mcdonald case, which I don't know what percentage of the American population knows about this case. Maybe it's 5%. That's a lot of people, though. But it was a very famous case for particularly in the late 70s and early 1980s when Mcdonald went to trial. But he was tried for killing his family on a military base in 1970. And there's been a long standing debate about whether or not he was guilty, and big time, figures have weighed in on both sides of the debate. And so the point of the first season of this podcast is to try to come in and make the definitive statement on this crime. But in any case, so that's one way. Beyond that, that's one way in which artistic, sort of aesthetic and intellectual, streams come together. I apologize if you can hear my daughter screaming.
I can't actually.
But apart from that, I'm sort of improvising and answering your question. In terms of, for example, conducting criminal investigations, I do think, and I thought this like in graduate school when I was, trying to hone my craft as a writer and as a historian, that when you come out of the artistic world and you've done things like made records, you're honing an aesthetic sensibility that does transfer. It's not always easy to explain how, but it does transfer to other projects. You just bring an aesthetic sensibility. You have a kind of eye for balance and grace and concision that might not be there. And so when I read books written by historians, often historians that are very good historians, I see a total lack of those elements in their writing. So their writing, this isn't everybody, but there's certain well-known historians who, when I read their writing, I'm like, this is awful writing. There's no aesthetic sensibility. It's just a train wreck. The content is there. They've done the work. They've dug through archives. They've learned the language. They're smart and everything, but there's just no grace to this text. Whereas, writers like Christopher Hitchens or Gore Vidal or Alexander Cockburn, some of the great sort of mostly left-wing intellectuals of the past 50 years, brought this incredible artistic sensibility to the craft of writing, and the sentences themselves were like small works of art. And so I feel that I was a little more attuned to that side of the intellectual project, and that certainly is there as well in the podcast. I took great pains to kind of craft the text so that the text could be the spoken part of the podcast was beautiful as a text,
Right. I
and
agree.
yeah, I think there's something like that that can even go on in running criminal investigations, when reports, um, like we go to great pains to make our reports extremely readable. And these are like, there's not a lot of room for art in a report on a crime, but there is to some degree. There's the same kind of thing. There's an aesthetic sensibility that the whole report will have a kind of body that hangs together with more or less grace. And so it's there, it's always there, the artistic sensibility.
And why do you think that that's important, especially in something like a criminal report?
Well, one reason why it's important is just totally pragmatic, which is that people are used to reading hard to read reports that you have to sludge through. And a lot of times, groups like us, what we're trying to do is we're trying to attract the interest of law enforcement to cases that they've been ignoring or they just haven't shown an interest in. We're trying to do some of the initial groundwork for them, sort of toss it up to them like, hey, there's something really important that's happened here. There's been this murder or something that you guys have ignored. And we want you to take a look at it. So when you get somebody's attention, when they're willing to sit down and read your report for a half hour, if it's really well written, meaning that it's written with the reader in mind, like you want the reader to have a nice experience and for it to just go down like lemonade rather than like sludge. You're way more
like
likely
a spoonful of sugar.
Spoonful of sugar, yes. And you're way more likely to get through, to achieve your objective, which is to get them interested. You know what I mean? And the way you lay out facts, the way you lay out a narrative, if there's any artistry to it, if it's a little more like a story one might read than just the typical bureaucratic one fact after another thing, you're more likely to break through. You're more likely to capture people's imaginations and their interest. And so that's one reason why. But then there's another reason, which is it's hard to put your finger on it. It goes to the whole concept of grace. What does it even mean? And it's very hard to put your finger on that. Why does certain art, cut so deep? You seem to move beyond the perimeter of language, when you get into really great art, and it has these qualities like grace and concision and so on, but you can't say why it's so important, but it is, at least for people that have eyes to see it.
And is that feeling, that terminology that you used, is that come from or rooted in the evangelical background that you spoke of earlier? Is that a new transformative view of grace or a more mature view of grace? Or that's not a word that I hear often out of context of a faith.
Yeah, no, I don't mean
you will. So
yeah,
not necessarily religious, but just tell me what it means a little bit more, where it comes from you. What does it mean to you, that grace?
It's a quality of balance and just the right degree of ornateness, right? If something is overly ornate, overly involved, too many words, right? Too much said, it lacks grace. And so it's the meeting ground of delicacy and power, when something is very well structured, like, so to give you an example, I always think of Charlie Kaufman stories, and a couple in particular, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Adaptation. Those stories have tremendous grace because first of all, you can watch them 100 times. And the reason why you can keep watching and watching and watching is because you keep seeing new things. You keep seeing hints about what's to come early in the movie. You watch the movie the 50th time, you go, oh my gosh, look at that. In the first minute there, he's referring to something that happens at the end of the movie. I just noticed that. And it goes the other direction. And you see that the plot is sort of winding around and folding in on itself like a beautiful Christmas ornament, and not in some random way, right? Not in some like, oh, you're just being weird and making all kinds of random references and whatever. No, the longer you look, the more sense the whole thing makes, So and he's outstanding in this regard. I mean, his stories have grace for me in a way that is, I mean, there probably are other writers who are in his category, but I probably don't know any of them that I can think of. Maybe Cormac McCarthy or someone, but when I compare him to the usual fare, some of which is fine, it's enjoyable and so forth, what you see on TV at night and so on, he's just in a completely different category. And that comparison that sort of sheds some light on the concept of grace, right? There's a person who knows how to tell a good story because they read that book by what's his face, who actually is featured in adaptation, Robert something or other. What is it called? You know what I'm talking about? Anyways, it's the book everybody reads.
My brain does not remember anything like that, any sort of details or titles or names or like, I don't, something happened to it last year with the pandemic. It just I don't know. So I'd have to do research and kind of go in the back door to figure it out. But
yeah, if you saw the cover, you would have seen the cover before. In any case, I'm just saying that, there's a type of person, who can write for TV, for example. They know the basic components of putting together a plot that makes sense. And so they can write at a sort of competent level. And then there are people like Charlie Kaufman, where it's like, he's pushing the entire form of writing to this higher level. So what's interesting about you mentioning the kind of evangelical thing, as you know, grace has a very kind of specific meaning in that context, but there is this religious transcendent dimension to the idea, because when you take in art like that, you feel that the artist is pushing the form, pushing what humans are capable upward, in a way that begins to feel miraculous. You just can't believe what you're seeing, the beauty of it. And for me, at least, when I encounter that kind of beauty, it pushes on it pushes on an intuition. It advances an intuition that this cannot be accidental. Something this beautiful and gorgeous cannot be a product of a universe that exploded into existence for no purpose, right? It feels as though this is pointing to some sort of divinity, some sort of divine design, some transcendent domain. And so in that way, there is a kind of religious element to it,
And it's interesting because I think what you just said to me is the embodiment of being a creative, whether that's, being a musician or a writer or an actor or an entrepreneur or a parent, anybody that creates something from nothing in a way that pushes and makes others transcend or makes themselves transcend, is filled with grace in a religious but not religious way. It just kind of transforms the spirit in a profound way. So that's thank you for summarizing my thoughts on being a creator. I appreciate that. Tell me how this perspective informs your personal life. So we've talked a lot about how it informs your career and your music and investigations. How does it inform your life as a husband and as a father, as a friend? Tell me how you mold those, weave those parts, those elements together as well.
That's a good question. I don't know. In my personal life, the categories I tend to work in are less aesthetic for sure and more ethical, the various roles, that you just mentioned, husband, father, friend, these are part of a very old system, an ancient system for improving people, which is a system that I believe in, and that obviously breaks down at least half the time, right? Families at least half the time, marriages at least half the time fall apart, and half the time when they stay together, they should fall apart to be better for both parties. and families can turn into living hells, and right, it can be a big mess. um it's funny, like we both have this religious history and know about, we're familiar with a lot of the religious stories, the biblical stories. And it's not an accident that in the early chapters of Genesis, it's pure dysfunction from the word go, right? So uh, the first two brothers, one kills the other one, right? I mean, there's
Mm,
incest. It's just anarchy from the word go. And that's one of the things that's powerful about those stories, and gives the text a power that transcends basic myth. Basic myth,
mm,
like Beaver Cleaver, everybody's great, but this text is much more serious. It's about the way things really are. And so even though it's, thousands of years old, it's right away pointing to these things that have been there from the beginning, since people have been getting together, trying to be monogamous, having children, and so on. There's been these messes that, ensue. Um, but the flip side of it is that these relationships, they call upon you to sacrifice yourself, um, for the sake of other people, right? You expand your sense of responsibility so that you're no longer just taking care of yourself. You're also taking care of your partner and your friends and your children above all. Um, so, anyways, I'm kind of rambling, but I think of all this much more in ethical terms, and I think of it as a project, not to trivialize it, but like it holds the promise of making me a better person, right?
mhm,
To take these relationships as seriously as I possibly can. And that's how I think about them. Um,
mhm.
the aesthetics don't really come into it. I mean, I'll probably, once we stop talking 3 hours from now, it'll occur to me that there is some
Mm.
aesthetic dimension, but I've never thought about it. I mean, you're asking that question. I've never even thought about it.
Well, so for me, if I can add some from my perspective, to me that is also a very applicable uh, way to apply the grace that you're speaking of.
Mm,
So it helps us as individuals to transcend that, nature to be in chaos. It helps us to help our children to learn how to transcend that, to practice that grace, um, that higher pushing towards something bigger than ourselves. So to me, to me, it seems very interwoven, and there can't be much of a break. For me personally, it seems like it would be harder to weave that into a professional career, investigating or something.
You
That to
know,
me is harder than the other.
yeah, you're right. And now I realize, yeah, now I get it. Now, okay, so here it's so
I
interesting.
mean, that might not be true for you, but
No, 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 it is true for me. You're right. And what's funny about this is Tammy, my wife, was just saying what you just said. Uh, so Tammy is a choreographer, um, and she was saying maybe a week or two ago, we were talking one night, and she was saying that creation ex nihilo, just like you just said, making something out of nothing. Um, this is like this is the way in which humans mimic the divine and partake of the divine, right? I mean, this is the beginning of everything, is God speaking the world into existence, and humans sort of imitate the creator when they create their own little beautiful things, and they can create such incredible things. I mean, we all know just what an amazing piece of art, what a miracle it seems like. Particularly, it's
mm,
funny, just a footnote on that. We're living now in an age where um, uh, many people are being called to account. Um, some of them rightly, some of them totally unjustly, but regardless, it's a moment where lots of people are seeing, oh, that artist you like so much, who makes those incredible, beautiful things. Well, he may have been molesting children, he may have been raping
mm,
people, and this is a fact of life I've been familiar with for a long time. I had a kind of watershed moment, decades ago, where I met somebody that I admired artistically, and he was such a disappointment as a human being. And I was like, forget it. I'm cutting the cord right here. I don't care, right? Because I think of artists as being, they're like divine, they're transistors for divine frequencies, right? I mean, it is a gift to be able to create a beautiful piece of art, and it really, at the end of the day, doesn't say anything about you ethically. You can be a terrible person and create great art,
mm,
and I don't think your art should be banned because you're a terrible person. I think, we should acknowledge that you're a terrible person. You should pay the price for that socially and so on. But if you've made great art, we should all enjoy it. So in any case, Tammy was saying that, this is like arguably the most important thing is creating out of nothing. And certainly with my children are obviously very creative. Their creative impulses are running off in all directions. But I have tried to imbue in them a certain aesthetic instinct about any track I have put them on creatively. So my son loves to draw. And so for that reason, we have him practicing drawing and watching. He watches these little videos that teach him how to draw and so forth, and get him into the feeling of what it's like to hone a craft and to look back on drawings you made 2 months ago and ones you're doing now and see what progress looks like and get a taste for that. And he's in jiu-jitsu. He and I both do jiu-jitsu, and jiu-jitsu for people that are into it is very much an artistic enterprise. It has a sort of violent self-defense component. But if you see jiu-jitsu practice at a high level, it's talk about grace. I mean, it's incredibly beautiful. And there too, that's one where you are forced to suffer, just like one does in life, in order to master any domain, which is why I feel it's great. It's going against the grain of contemporary parenting culture. But I mean, I don't want anybody to get genuinely hurt, but it's great for kids to wrestle each other and have to learn these moves and learn how to win and do it for a year or two and look back and say, oh my God, look at how much skill I have. Look at how much better I am at this thing, this craft, and yeah, I don't, it would be very hard ultimately to raise functional human beings who can go out into the wild waters of the world and swim rather than sink without getting them on these tracks. And it doesn't necessarily matter which tracks you get them on. It could almost be anything. You just want to get them into some domain that they're drawn to and get them to internalize the discipline to experience the progress and to get that taste. It's interesting. I've spent no time thinking, it's not true. I've spent too little time thinking about video games and screens to have some really strong opinion about it. I think about them all the time because they're everywhere, and as my kids get older,
Right.
But there is this one fact about video games that strikes me as potentially relevant to kids, which is as they become so realistic, you can get closer and closer to experiencing the rewards of real world accomplishment through these virtual worlds. And that's problematic because, so I've seen, for example, studies that, show that like the video games, when you're winning and you're getting these points and you're conquering the Zelda or whatever. I love these games, but I'm not super into them, but they're great. But that like it's hitting the same dopamine circuits that drugs do, but also that real world accomplishments, actually winning the medal does, right? And so it's sort of hijacking the reward machinery of the brain, but you're not in the real world. You're not actually learning how to do anything important, and so anyways, it's just, I think, yeah, we're getting into parenting, we're all over the place, but in any case, that is where the aesthetic thing maybe fits. To get back to your question, it's less so on the horizontal relationships with friends and well, no, that's not quite true. Okay, it fits on you're asking good philosophical questions, so I'm having to make reversals mid-sentence, mid-thought. But it fits
Goal
on
accomplished.
Yeah, it fits with the child rearing in the way that we talked about. But then I would say in the horizontal relationships, there is also an aesthetic dimension to that. It's the art of friendship, which obviously there's been a lot written about. Aristotle and so forth, wrote about it. And there too, there really is an art and a skill to maintaining good relationships with people. And this is totally obvious because we all know people who are particularly unskilled. And we all have people probably, right, in our families, right, who you might have set free long ago because they're such a pain in the ass, but they're family. And so you learn to deal with difficult people. But among the things you learn is that some people are difficult and they don't have that artistic right? They can't navigate relationships in a way that is artistic and graceful in the way
Grace-filled.
I think that you were mentioning, right? Giving people grace and so on. Yeah, so.
It's great. What do I follow that up with? Let's see. What about the person who is maybe on two separate tracks, but really wants those tracks to merge? How do you have any advice for people that struggle with that balance between the aesthetic and the everyday, or that they're so polarized that they can't seem to cross over and they desperately want to imbue their careers with more grace? Do you have any advice for the youngins coming up who need to be put on that track of practicing that discipline?
Well, until you said for the youngins,
Or old ones, what, whomever.
well, I and don't hold me to what I'm about to say because I don't have time to really think it through, but offhand, see the youngins, you know, you want, I feel, if you're 19 and you have serious artistic aspirations and you're willing to commit, you know, I mean, there's lots of people who are 19 and have artistic aspirations and are just hanging out waiting to be discovered. And then there's the person who's like, you know, the war of art, gonna hone their craft 20 hours a day, totally committed. That type of person, if you're willing to put that type of focus and discipline into the artistic enterprise, then it is worth giving yourself time. I mean, maybe a decade, whatever. But you know, go all in. Don't. It's not. You're not likely to produce anything worthwhile artistically if you're so pragmatic when you're 20 that you think, well, I'm going to do my art, but I'm also going to try to get into a job, or I've got a retirement plan. It's like, no, just go hardcore, recognize that the likelihood of failure is very high because great artists, even if you're amazing, slip through the cracks every day of the week, and mediocre artists are catapulted to fame and fortune all the time. So it's not like a particularly you know, reliable lottery. It's a lottery. I mean, that's what it is, you know. But go do it. You know, take that journey. And when you're 20, I don't even think you should be thinking in 10 years I'll let this go. No, just go into it with the thought that this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to commit everything I've got to this. There's only so many hours in the day. I'm going to commit all of it to this, and you know, see where it takes you. You know, if you're 35 and you decide don't want to keep living on ramen for the rest of my life, I'd like to have a family. If I'm going to have a family, I need to have some money. Then you can do whatever you're going to do at that point, and whatever you got to make it work. But the journey will have taught you a lot, you know, and you'll probably be able to take it with you into your whatever other career you're going to do. Now, if you're older and you just have an artistic side and an artistic life, but you can't integrate it with your work, I don't really know, other than to sort of return to what I mentioned earlier, which is that, you know, a lot of these sensibilities are strengths. I mean, writing is an example. That's what I'm particularly familiar with. But if you bring to journalism, for example, a real aesthetic sensibility, you are going to create works of journalism that are much more lasting. We talk about grace, the strength component of grace. They're going to be things that people want to read. I want to read what Christopher Hitchens thought about, you know, Bloody Sunday. I want to read about what did he say in 1983 when Beirut was bombed. I want to read about everything he ever thought about anything, because the writing is so delicious and beautiful that I just want to go and hear the lecture. You know what I mean? I don't care at all what the typical New York Times writer was saying in 1983. That's just like a historical artifact. I'll read the summary. What were they saying? You know, like but I want to hear Christopher Hitchens' words, you know, because he brought that artistic sensibility to his work as a journalist and as an intellectual. And you know, it's maybe easy to see the connection with things like journalism and, you know, intellectual production. But I do think, I mean, like I say, in the context of criminal investigations, there is an aesthetic dimension. And so I think people should, if they have an artistic sensibility and they've honed that over the years, they should regard it as a strength, and they should look for ways to apply it, even if they're in a job that's, like a desk job. I don't know how helpful that is, but that's what comes to mind.
No, that's great. That's great. What do you want to be remembered for? What do you want your legacy to be, as an artist, or any which way? What do you want your legacy to be?
So I want, so the big thing, right, is for my children to think that they had a good dad, right? I want, if I were to disappear tomorrow, my daughter's too young, but my son, I want his memory to be that his dad was like all in on him. Like I don't want my kids ever thinking like, oh, unfortunately my dad, he worked a lot, and so I didn't really get to see him, which that happens to perfectly decent people. I just want to make every effort to make sure that my children felt attended to, and that I set a good example for them. That is an extremely lofty aspiration. It sounds banal, but it's just, you know it as well as I do, that once you're actually trying to run a family, or like manage this little unit, the idea that you're going to go fix the world like you thought you were going to do when you were 20, I'm going to go fix the world, I'm going to bring down capitalism, whatever it is you thought you were going to do, suddenly it seems so absurd, because you realize like this is a relatively simple unit, and it is almost impossible to do right. It's so hard
so
to get it
hard.
right and then not fuck everybody up, including yourself. And so the idea that you're going to go solve something complicated like an economy or something is just, it's so absurd. But in any case, I want to do well with that little project. That matters to me much more than anything else. I have, I really have never had any desire, even though I was in bands and so on, for any kind of fame or recognition or anything like that. And, I'm sure it's the same with you. Like, I've met plenty of people over the years who have garnered a lot of recognition, a fair amount of fame and so on. And they're all over the map in terms of quality of human being and so forth. But that whole experience of knowing people in that position has left me, it's reinforced my sense that is just pointless. Like who cares, and so many people are captured by that idea of, I mean, it's what social media is all about, that idea of fame and people looking at you and liking you and so on. I don't care about that at all. So I wouldn't care if I wasn't remembered or anything historically. I'm sure I won't be. But I want the people that knew me, I want those people to feel that they were loved, and that they were not abused or manipulated or in any way treated as something, other than what they deserve to be treated as. And as I say, it's a lofty aspiration. That's not like, I'm not saying that like, isn't that a great thing for me to say or something like that. That is very, very hard to do. I recognize that it's very, very hard to do it right, to be a good dad, to be a good husband. It's hard things to do. And I fail at it all the time. So for that very reason, that's like the abiding goal. And I want my kids to have a sense that he did good, my dad did good or whatever. On the artistic side, it's interesting because I think the first record I ever made that like came out, and it was in stores and stuff, came out in 97. So how long ago was that? What, 97, 2007? 2017,
24.
about 25 years ago almost, right? So it's a quarter of a century. So
Jesus, that sounds like a long time ago when you put it that way.
But when I look back, I think I can't remember if I mentioned this to you before, but I during the pandemic, I was getting all these messages on Instagram, and people were posting stuff about the Autumns. And I found it really surprising, because the Autumns was it's not like a lot of people knew about that band, but the people that did know about it were like, really into it, a lot of those people and so forth. And so people were sending me stuff about, a lot of people were sending me stuff about the first Autumns record, The Angel Pool. And I think I was like 19 when I was writing a lot of those songs for that record. So I hadn't listened to it in many years. I had never listened to it. I went back and listened to it, and I thought, some of this is all right. It's 25 years later. Some of this stuff holds up. a lot of it, naturally, you think, oh God, listen to my voice and I sound so melodramatic or whatever you think, but it was all right. I mean, we did a beautiful thing. We made some beautiful things, and I'd like that. I'd like for, in the same way that I like to go read what Hitchens was saying about 1983 in Beirut or whatever, I'd like for some of these things to have a grace. The grace is the theme of this conversation, as it turns out.
Yeah.
I'd like them to have a grace that allows them to endure, so that a person who's reasonably educated aesthetically and understands what they're listening to could go back and listen to one of these records. And it's really more about the songs. It's asking too much, at least of me, to make like really good records. But we made a lot of records and EPs and so forth, and there are some really good songs in there. There's some songs that hold up very well, and that's nice. I'm glad I made those. They're little gifts, to the universe. They're little things that I know people enjoy the same way I've enjoyed other people's music over the years, and that does mean a lot to me. And there's little songs I've written for my wife and so on, and those are specials. I mean, they're like like a ring you would give somebody or something, and so it would be nice, if, I don't know, 50 years from now or something, I think about that, like I wonder, my kids, what on earth, you can't run the simulation. You can't, there's not enough bandwidth. You don't understand enough about the world. It's too complicated to know what a song you wrote in 1997 is going to sound like when your kid is 30, but I think it would be fun if, when one of my kids was 30, if they could listen to some pop song I wrote, Dad, listen to this nice little pop song, and liked it, and so that they could just sort of glimpse that element of my life creatively. That would be fun. So I guess all I care about is what my kids think. I guess I don't care.
The sign of a good parent, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the truth, fundamentally, I don't think, I've literally never thought about what I want my legacy to be or whatever, because I don't regard myself as like a person who would have a legacy, you know what I mean? But anybody who stumbles across something I've written, like the book, or stumbles across songs I've written, it would be nice if they liked it. That's your hope, is that people will enjoy and benefit from these things,
and be moved by something you've done. So you mentioned the podcast.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea when or how people can listen to that yet? Is that still forthcoming? What are you working on now? What's going on with that, or anything else that you have in the pipes? What can your fans look forward to?
Yeah. So that'll be out. I don't know exactly when that's going to be out. We're very close.
Great.
But it'll be available on all the streaming platforms, I'd say, in the next 3 months. We'll start dropping those episodes. And that's, we put a lot of work. I mean, I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts myself, and I think it'll be evident to people that this is a podcast that far more work went into this podcast than goes into the average true crime podcast, which is, there's a lot of good average true crime podcasts, but this is something I think that is special. It's and it's not a normal true crime podcast. It's really it goes much more deep into the historical dimensions of the crime and into history itself than a typical true crime podcast would. So it's, I'm a historian who runs a criminal investigation firm. It's a somewhat unusual combination of skills and so forth, and it really reflects that. So hopefully people will enjoy it. And the only other thing,
That's called The Looking Glass.
That's called The Looking Glass, yes.
Okay.
And then the only other thing,
look out for it.
Yeah. The only other thing I would put out there is I think there's a little EP I made. This is on the musical front, where I have not been very active in the last couple of years, but there's a little EP I made with Knick Weiller, who is from Bro Safari and Evol Intent. Nick is, I mean, he's kind of famous. I think he's got like 250,000 followers on Instagram or whatever, but he's really big in like the electronic world. And he and I did this little project together back in 2012, which we just posted on SoundCloud, and which people really liked, but it never really came out. And I think we're going to re-release that, possibly a remastered version of that, on all the streaming platforms, Apple Music and Spotify and so on. and it would be good if people heard that. That record came out in 2012. It was, I thought, if anything ever makes me $1 million, it's got to be this little record, because it was so catchy. I mean, in terms of the stuff I've produced over the years, it was so catchy. People always liked right away. They were like, "Oh my God, I love this," And I think right around the same time, Pyramids, another band that I'm in. So Minus Music. I mean, we didn't really put it out, but it got minimal attention. And then Pyramids put out the weirdest thing I ever did, a record called A Throne Without a King, which was mostly static. It was mostly, I mean, just that mostly.
Okay.
And that got reviewed everywhere. Everybody weighed in on that thing, man. Like I couldn't. It was like I don't know what we did there, but people felt they had to say what they thought that was. And I was like, well, now here you go. This is my life. I put out a record static. Everybody talks about it. I put out this pop thing that could make me $1 million. Nobody hears it. So we're re-releasing. That's called Minus Music.
Minus Music. Okay.
Yeah. And I don't have a hub for me, really, in terms of putting stuff out. The only social media I have that I attend to is Instagram. So if anybody wants to follow me on Instagram, it's at Matthew Kraig Kelly, and Kraig with a K, at Matthew Kraig Kelly. And
I'll put your links and stuff in the in the notes.
Yeah. So when the Looking Glass comes out and those episodes are going to drop and so forth, I'll put something up about that on
Okay.
Instagram. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Any sort of summation or brilliant thought that you came to, as we moved on? Anything else that people need to know about how you balance the arts and the life and all the things that you do?
I'm still learning myself, so I know nothing comes to mind, but this has been an interesting interview. Your questions they go deep, so it's interesting. Normally when you do I'll do interviews sometimes for work, and they're very circumscribed in terms of the topical range, and a lot of times people let you know what they're going to ask in advance, so you can kind of prepare your answers. So this has kind of been interesting because you've asked questions I've never asked myself, and I feel like I've asked myself most questions. So well done.
Hooray! Thank you. I like unscripted, so I like to not show the questions if possible, and also I really just kind of came up with them just before our interview, so I didn't really have them ahead of time. But I really wanted to go a little deeper, and I know that you would be very ripe for it because you and I have had these deep conversations in the past, and so I know that I was hoping I could get it out of you, and it's really kind of what I want to do with this whole thing. So thank you for indulging me. Thank you for joining us. And thank you everybody for joining us on the Artist Collective radio show. Please like the show, subscribe to it, and be the first to know when the next one drops. And thanks again for coming. And thank you again, Matthew. And we will see you next time.